When we map out the history of philosophy, the narrative usually takes this massive leap, right? We tend to jump directly from Immanuel Kant's critical project straight into the absolute idealism of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. But doing that entirely overlooks the most rigorous, crucial hinge of that entire intellectual revolution, Salomon Maimon. In today's explainer, we're not just looking at Maimon as some biographical curiosity. We are examining an incredibly precise analytical philosopher, a thinker who exposed the fatal structural flaws in Kant's system, and in doing so, literally forced the trajectory of German idealism.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with Maimon's context and his Maimonidean ideal. Then, we'll dive into his critique of the Kantian system, breaking down the crucial distinction between quid juris and quid facti. After that, we'll explore how concepts apply to the sensible given, unpack his fascinating doctrine of differentials and the infinite understanding, and finally, look at how he walks the razor's edge between skepticism and idealism.
So, let's jump straight into part 1, context and the Maimonidean ideal.
To really grasp the weight of Maimon's critique, we have to recognize that his intellectual roots lay far, far outside the traditional German academic establishment. Born Shlomo ben Yehoshua in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, he was a Talmudic prodigy. But near the age of 30, he made a pivotal choice. He adopted the surname Maimon. This wasn't just a simple name change. It was a deliberate, powerful signal of his profound philosophical alignment with the medieval rationalism of Moses Maimonides.
As Maimon himself wrote, I regarded him as the ideal of a perfect human being, and his doctrines as having been dictated by divine wisdom itself. This deep, unwavering allegiance to Maimonides instilled in him a classical, contemplative ideal. It gave him an absolute belief in the sovereignty of universal reason. And this medieval, fundamentally Aristotelian framework actually laid the critical groundwork for the epistemological modism he would later weaponize against Kant.
Moving on to Section 2, critiquing the Kantian system.
When Maimon first got his hands on Kant's critique of pure reason, he didn't just read it, he rigorously anatomized it. The philosophy he developed in response is what he called a coalition system. It's a brilliant synthesis. By integrating the substance-based monism of Spinoza, the infinitesimal calculus of Leibniz, and the empirical skepticism of David Hume, Maimon realized something profound. He saw that Kant's strict dualism, the split between the mind and the world, left an absolute, unbridgeable chasm.
Which brings us to Section 3, quid juris versus quid facti.
Maimon framed his entire intervention around two legalistic terms that Kant himself had used. First up is the quid facti, the question of fact. Now, Kant simply assumed it was an undeniable, straightforward fact that we possess synthetic a priori knowledge in mathematics and physics. But Maimon pushed back hard. He argued that in our actual finite human experience, this absolute certainty simply does not exist. Think about it. If fire warms a stone, that connection is merely a matter of empirical probability. It is not an absolute logical necessity. And if you deny the fact of this absolute knowledge, the second question, the quid juris, or the question of right, takes on an entirely new, devastating dimension. Kant asked, by what right do pure concepts apply to experience? Maimon expanded this to address what is arguably the ultimate philosophical problem. How can entirely heterogeneous realms, meaning the pure immaterial form of thought on one hand, and the raw blind matter of sensible intuition on the other, how can they ever legitimately interact?
Let's explore this further in Section 4, Concepts and the Sensible Given. Here, Maimon exposed a fatal structural flaw in Kant's transcendental deduction. You see, Kant insisted that our minds possess concepts and our senses receive intuitions, and that these two things are fundamentally different in kind. They are completely heterogeneous. But Maimon argued that this rigid dualism makes the application of a concept to the sensible given an impossible leap. If thought and sensation share no common nature, applying a pure concept to an intuition is literally like trying to apply a category of logic to a physical piece of wood. It doesn't work. Therefore, Maimon demanded a monistic framework, a single, continuous spectrum of knowledge bridging sensibility and understanding. This leads us directly to Section 5, Differentials and Infinite Understanding.
So, we're left with a massive question. If concepts and intuitions exist on a single continuum, what is the precise mechanism that bridges the infinite distance between them? Seriously, how does the pure abstract form of thought actually make contact with the raw, chaotic matter of intuition?
Maimon's answer to this is incredibly innovative, his doctrine of differentials.
He quite literally imported Leibnizian infinitesimal calculus right into the heart of epistemology. He argued that sensible intuitions are not just brute alien matter. Instead, they are generated from infinitely small conceptual elements. He called these differentials. By defining these as physical points rather than metaphysical ones, the raw data of our senses is suddenly understood as highly confused, infinitely minute conceptual thought. In this system, the metaphysical realm acts as the strict mathematical limit of the physical realm.
But for this differential continuum to hold together, it needs an ultimate metaphysical grounding. To guarantee this synthesis, Maimon posited an infinite understanding. In a divine, infinite mind, there is absolutely no difference between thinking an object and creating it. Form and matter are perfectly identical. Human sensibility, then, is merely incomplete, finite thought trying to grasp what the infinite mind understands purely. If you're listening closely, you can clearly hear the echoes of Spinoza and Maimonides here, specifically tailored to solve a Kantian crisis. Finally, Section 6, Between Skepticism and Idealism. Now, this extreme rationalism actually leads us right into a profound paradox. Maimon argues that, yes, in the infinite mind, everything is pure concept, logical necessity, and absolute idealism. The problem? We are not infinite. For finite human beings, bound by the limits of time and space, our grasp of the empirical world remains stubbornly contingent. Our knowledge is basically an asymptotic approach to the truth. We get closer and closer, but we never quite reach absolute objective certainty. As Maimon perfectly summarized, my transcendental philosophy takes up the problem that Kant's critique tries to solve, but in a much broader sense. My theory thus leaves room for Humean skepticism in all its force. By denying the reality of synthetic a priori judgments for finite minds, Maimon spectacularly revived Humean skepticism right inside the heart of the Kantian project. He proved that Kant's great defense against Hume ultimately fails because it assumes a level of certainty in experience that we simply do not possess.
And this specific epistemological crisis is exactly why Maimon is the true hinge of German idealism. In 1790, his devastating critique shattered orthodox Kantianism. He proved that maintaining a strict dualism between mind and world inevitably, unavoidably, collapses into skepticism. This realization is what forced the entire next generation of thinkers, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, to construct those massive, monistic systems of absolute idealism. They were all trying to solve the exact structural problems that Salomon Maimon diagnosed. As rigorous 20th century scholars like Marshall Geroldt have mapped out, Maimon's critique wasn't just some historical stepping stone that we eventually moved past. It remains a permanent structural challenge to absolutely any philosophical system that attempts to cleanly separate the mind from the world it seeks to know.
Which leaves us with a lingering, provocative thought to end on today. We so often view German idealism as a closed historical epoch, a chapter in a textbook. But looking at the state of modern epistemology, we really have to ask ourselves, has contemporary philosophy ever truly resolved that heterogeneous gap between concept and intuition? Or, in all our endless modern attempts to bridge the mind and reality, do we remain perpetually caught in Maimon's skeptical differential?